In a natural environment, there are checks and balances. The number of mice is controlled by natural enemies, like the kestrel. And the cat. Without these natural enemies, mice could breed unchecked. Like this. Australia. A couple of hundred years ago, there were no mice here at all. The first probably arrived with European settlers. In their new home, they found no natural enemies, so they bred into a serious problem, needing serious treatment. But alien animals can cause trouble here, in the United Kingdom as well. Mink. Introduced into Britain from North America to make fashionable fur coats. But mink escaped, or were released, from fur farms and can now be found living wild on many riverbanks. They often eat eels, but they also attack birds, like these common terns, birds that are actually quite rare. These were the victims of one mink in one night. But animals are not the only aliens to find their way into the country. Plants can also be carried around the world. Many garden plants are wild flowers in other countries and only brought to this country over the last couple of hundred years. Most garden plants need careful cultivation. They need the care and attention of a gardener and can often only really survive when they're safely inside the garden. But some plants, those that are strong growing or that can seed freely, can escape out of the garden and into the wild. Giant hogweed. Introduced from the south of Russia over 100 years ago as a spectacular new garden plant. But hogweed can also cause this. The swelling is rather like terrible sunburn and sometimes causes the damaged skin to remain sensitive to light for several years. The plants themselves are not the only problem, because if you import a pot plant, then you also get this, the soil. And the soil can be a home for hundreds of tiny eggs and animals, many of them too small to see. And that is probably the way into the country used by a recent introduction, a kind of flatworm.
When flatworms are in an area, you can usually reckon on finding them when it's under something like this. Yes.
The New Zealand flatworm.
They're covered in slime and you often see them lying on the soil surface in a tight coil and glistening with all the slime that's on them.
They're sensitive to the light, so as soon as we start to look, the flatworm slithers away.
You can see here the head end, which is moving around, and it has eyes on either side of it, and it moves from side to side in order to determine which is the most favourable light intensity for it.
In the laboratory, the flatworms are kept cool in the fridge. But once they're moved into the warmer air, they become far more active.
The mouth is on the underside of it and about halfway along. And then behind that are the reproductive organs. And after mating, they produce cocoons or capsules, this black ball-shaped object, and that may contain up to 10 new flatworms. It's important because it feeds, as far as we can tell, exclusively on earthworms. And earthworms make vital contributions to our soil fertility and plant growth.
Earthworms pull scraps of leaf underground, devour them, and then mix the waste into the soil. And their tunnels help water and air enter the soil.
It feeds by enveloping an earthworm. It wraps itself around it. And then instead of doing what we do, which is we digest our food inside our bodies, it actually digests its food outside its body. So it dissolves the earthworm and then sucks up the juices.
And all that's left is the contents of the earthworm's gut, in a smear of body fluid.
What we're doing to investigate this is to find out as much as we can about the biology and ecology of it, because without knowing that, we're not going to be able to understand the problem fully. So we make a lot of observations in the field.
Flatworms lie on the surface of the soil, anywhere there is shelter. Here, the shelter's provided by a ceramic tile. A series of them are placed around the field and checked regularly to give an estimate of the number of flatworms. They've discovered that as the number of flatworms goes up, the number of earthworms goes down. To look in more detail, back to the lab. These pipes contain soil. A month ago, they were filled with soil, along with 7 earthworms and a single flatworm. Now it's time to empty the pipes and see what's left. The pipe breaks into numbered sections, so they can record exactly where the worms have got to, as well as how many are left.
Number 2 full. Okay.
First find is the flatworm itself. Then an earthworm. Sifting, searching for anything that will increase their knowledge of the flatworm and its life.
Earthworm 5. Earthworm 6.
And the results? There's still 1 flatworm, but when the 3 egg capsules hatch, that could increase to 30. Of the 7 earthworms, there are now only 4, and a half. A leftover piece of worm, paralysed but not eaten.
We have to face the fact that the flatworm is here to stay. We're not going to be able to get rid of it. So if we want to do something about it and to reduce its effect on earthworms, we have to find ways of reducing the numbers of flatworms. Now, we could look at, for example, at pesticides, but really they're not on because we would have to treat such a large area, and also the flatworms shelter when they're on the soil surface, and so it's difficult to contact them with the pesticide. I believe our best bet for finding a solution is to find something that will actually attack the flatworm and kill the flatworm, another organism, a natural enemy.
So this alien, the New Zealand flatworm, could become a pest, but might, in the future, itself be controlled by introducing another species, one of its natural enemies.
Biological pest control involves the discovery and use of an organism which, under natural conditions, would kill another organism, which humans regard as a bit of a pest. Now, in glasshouse situations, there are many insect pests of crops. For example, in tomatoes, you have problems with whitefly.
We can have really devastating problems in glasshouses. There have been many occasions in the past where growers have actually had to abandon crops because pests have become so serious. By feeding on the plants in high numbers, they literally suck the goodness out of them, and we get less fruit as a result. They also spoil the quality of the fruit. Fruit gets sticky, and we supply supermarkets who have very exacting standards, and they don't want fruit of that type. Well, 20 years ago, we used to rely very much on chemical pesticides for control. There were lots available, there were new ones being developed, they were relatively cheap, and they were very effective. They wiped out pests with one spray.
But not anymore. Pesticide sprays have become less effective as insect pests have gradually become resistant to them. Entomologists, insect specialists, have had to look at the problem in a completely different way.
It's up to the entomologists to find another insect which can control and kill these insect pests. But before you can introduce the control, you must understand the actual life cycle of your pest insect.
The adult whitefly crawls under the leaf to lay its eggs. Tiny pale specks, which darken to black before hatching into slow-moving larvae, called crawlers. These grow into scales, from which a new adult emerges. The family portrait: adult, crawler, scale, all surrounded by black specks of eggshell.
The discovery of the control for whitefly, which is now used commercially by growers, was made purely by accident in the 1920s by a grower who noticed that on the underside of his leaves, amongst those white scales of whitefly, he found some black ones. Well, when the insect emerged from this black scale, it was identified as a small wasp called Incarcia famosa. And this parasite lays its eggs in the individual scales of the whitefly. The actual larva develops inside the scale, and after about 4 weeks, it hatches out as another Incarcia. And then the Incarcia goes and lays more eggs in more whitefly scales.
For growers to be able to use this biological pest control, they have to be able to get hold of the wasp Incarcia. The company where Claire works supplies them.
At Natural Pest Control, we produce a range of beneficial insects which we sell to growers. Step one is actually to breed your insect pest. Now, insect pests will breed faster on some plants and slow on others. Now, we choose the best plant for the insect pest. For whitefly, we actually grow tobacco. Now, this tobacco plant is the one that's normally grown and its leaves are dried and then they're rolled up and used in cigarettes. But in this case, it's grown on for 6 weeks until it's ready to be introduced into the whitefly house for the whitefly to lay their eggs onto.
So though it may seem surprising, when breeding the Incarcia control, stage one is to breed the pest, the whitefly.
The clean tobacco plant is brought into the house in which the adult whitefly are. Now, the tobacco plants here have got whitefly covering them. Now, these have laid enough eggs, and so I'm going to take them out now. Of which I'm going to put the mask on, because the whitefly are very active and they can get down your throat to make you choke. So it needs a good sharp tap, and the whitefly fly off onto that clean plant. And I walk backwards into a darkened room, and the whitefly fly off towards the light.
Looks like a grower's nightmare. A greenhouse devoted to breeding a pest, but without the whitefly, they can't breed the Incarcia control. Stage 2. Move the plant to the next greenhouse. In here, the whitefly eggs hatch and the scales mature. And then the plant is on the move again. To stage 3, when the enormous number of whitefly scales meet the Incarcia for the first time.
This tobacco plant has been in the Incarcia house for 3 days. The wasps are crawling over the whitefly scales and they're finding a suitable one to lay their egg into. This tobacco plant has been in the house 15 days, and as you can see, all the scales have turned black by now. And at this point, the leaves are harvested and the Incarcia are collected and put into packets and sent out as natural pest controls.
And how do they get there? There's no doubt that for the grower, this use of biological pest control is very successful. And for us, as consumers, it's good to know that these tomatoes, which can be bought in the high street supermarkets, have not been sprayed with pesticides. Biological controls work well in here because it's enclosed and separate from the rest of the environment. Now Blandford, in Dorset, has a pest problem to be solved. It's not caused by an alien, this is strictly a local beast, but the annual invasion is a problem nonetheless.
In fact, the first morning I went into work with it and walked straight in and burst into tears, and I think everybody wondered what was wrong with me until they saw what was happening with my leg.
And it was like a massive blister covering her whole eye, and it was like light blue around the bottom here, and it was just pure white over here, and it sagged down. And then during one lesson, she wasn't actually teaching me at the time, but it burst, and all the pus and gunk ran down the side of her face, and it was disgusting. You could see the stains. I wasn't actually in the lesson, but people told me about it. I'm glad I wasn't there, actually.
It starts off with just a rash under the skin. Just rub your hand over the rash, over the top of your skin, and you can just feel slight bumps underneath your leg. By the lunchtime of that same day, you start blistering. Went to the doctor's the following day. He actually lanced the blister, which then discharges, as you can see on there. You don't actually try to dress the thing, it's awful. Your foot just swims in all this green, with it running down your leg permanently, marks your leg.
And the villain? The Blandford fly. Now there's no doubt that the Blandford fly causes problems for people who live around here and for visitors and tourists. But this may be the answer. This mixture contains bacteria of a type called Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we call it BTI for short. But like any biological pest control, the use of BTI depends on thoroughly understanding the life of the pest.
This bit's rubbish up here. No chance anyway.
Need a bit higher bank and more tree cover really.
And understanding the Blandford fly begins with observation along the riverbank.
Right, we've arrived at a place that's got a good vertical bank. The soil structure's good, it's a loamy sort of soil with vertical cracks. The female flies crawl down the cracks to lay their eggs. Yes, it is a good place. I have found some on this soil here.
These eggs spend the winter in the riverbank, and then in the spring they're washed into the river and hatch into larvae, which live amongst the weed. They form pupae, and then out pops the adult fly, very tiny, but quite able to spoil the warm spring days in Blandford.
We did find what I think is the answer to this problem. There's a material that's been used in other parts of the world. It's a thing called BTI, which is a bacterially produced insecticide, and that just kills the larvae of this fly. When you add it to the river, it's swallowed by the fly larvae, and they then die.
So why doesn't BTI kill all the other animals in the river?
Well, it's because most animals that live in the river have got a very acid gut content, and that wipes out the bacteria really. But when the Blandford fly larvae swallow it, they have got a much less acid gut. In fact, it's a very alkaline gut, and that activates this substance and out they go. If you did put a very high dose of this material in the river, then some other insects might die, but in fact we use less than 1 part per million, which the Blandford fly larvae are quite sensitive to this, but other things it doesn't affect them at all.
You spray the bacteria onto the top of the river?
No, actually under the water, so the spray is under the water. It can't drift about onto the riverbanks or anything like that. It's actually put into the water where the larvae are feeding.
But how can the effect of a spray like this be measured?
This is water crowfoot. It's the weed that the blandfly larvae live on. By taking samples of this, we can count the number of larvae when we take it back to the laboratory, and by weighing each piece of weed, we can then standardise each sample, and in the end we've got the density of larvae, that's the number of larvae per gram of weed of blandfly larvae living in the river at this point.
That calculation, the number of larvae per gram of weed, can be used to compare sprayed areas with untreated stretches of water.
Oh, it was very effective. It killed sort of 19 out of 20 larvae that were there. It doesn't kill them all, because there are some that are sitting in little pockets of water where they don't get treated and so on, and there are other ones that are not feeding when you put it in. But yeah, generally it kills the majority of the larvae that are in there, and also it didn't kill anything else. We weren't able to detect any effect on other animals in the river.
But it's also vital to monitor other life in the river by kick sampling.
What you do is to put the net down in the water, downstream, the current's flowing that way of where you're standing. Then you kick the riverbed to disturb the animals. They're swept by the current into the net, and you take out the net, put the animals into a tray and count them.
All the sampling so far indicates that the BTI tests have not affected any other river life. They still find the same number of animals and the same range of species.
Well, hopefully what we'll be doing is trying to get a full permission from the Health and Safety Executive to treat the entire river. And if that's forthcoming in the next year or two, then we'll be treating the river and trying to reduce the numbers of flies in the area so that only a very few people get bitten in the future. Instead of the thousands that get bitten every year, perhaps only tens, if we'll do it properly.
We've seen that biological controls could be the answer to the problem of pests. Some, at any rate. But we have to be very careful, because habitats are very fragile. They can easily be disturbed by introducing alien species. Meanwhile, here on the River Stour, the monitoring goes on to make sure that one biological control, bacterium BTI, can be used safely.